9. The Savior Returns. Written by Celestial Rainstorm. Narrated by AJ the Elementalgod. Chapter 13. The Fallout. The two-stitch punks raced down the first floor. They carefully navigated their way through the shattered rafters, down the stairs and into the drawing room of the cabin. The others had been alerted by the horrific shriek above them, and all snapped to look at the two male ragdolls sprinting towards them.
"Guys! Everyone! It's the beast!"
9 shouted to the others.
"It found us?"
7 asked sharply.
7, get the others out of the safe place. I'll distract it and give you more time,"
9 said quickly, handing 5 the light staff.
"We can't let it get back to the machines. It'll lead them straight to us." "No, 9, no, you can't. Not on your own,"
5 began, but 9 cut him off sharply.
"There's no time. Don't worry, I have a plan,"
he said before turning away and running upstairs as fast as his legs could carry him. He only had a short amount of time to prepare his trap. 5 looked worriedly after him as he and 7 hurried everyone out of the house. 9 was busy tying ropes around a sharp plank suspending the rafters of the cabin attic. There were only a few splintering planks that had hung over the first floor. It was sickeningly far below him as he stood over a hole where it seemed a large piece of debris had crashed through the cabin. On the other end of the string, a large heavy book stood erect. 9 finished the task with skilled fingers and ran down the first floor again. It was empty, and he was revealed to see that 5 and 7 had hidden the others away. He hid behind a wall, running through the plan one last time. His thoughts were interrupted by the beast crashing through the door, sending splinters flying everywhere, every other which way. 9 forced himself not to gasp as he pressed himself against the wall. He listened as the cat beast tore through the cabin, wildly snarling. It slashed through books, tore apart any possible hiding place, and smashed through the beams supporting the structure. They must be in there, somewhere, hiding like little cowards. 9 could feel himself shaking, but he knew that it was his only chance to get rid of the cat beast once and for all. He inhaled and leaped out from behind the wall.
"Hey! Looking for me?"
He yelled to the beast. The monster whipped around to look at him. He stood upon the first step of the flight of stairs, ready to lead up to the broken attic. The beast snarled in a terrible sound and raced up towards 9. 9 turned and immediately began to scramble up the steps, climbing as fast as he could. The cat beast easily caught up to him halfway up the spiraling staircase. He raised a claw and pounced, ready to tear the ragdoll to shreds. However, as it landed right behind him, its left foreleg crashed through the steps, and it was slammed into the next rung. The whole cabin shook as 9 nearly fell backwards into the monster's clutches. He managed to gain his footing and race up the steps. The cat beast yanked its limb out from the step, splintering it. It pursued its prey across the second floor. 9 just managed to evade the beast and clambered up a bookcase onto the attic's planks. The cat beast's claws missed him, but were centimeters. He jumped onto the thin, creaking boards. They rocked up and down dangerously. 9 tried to keep his balance. Then the beast nearly landed on top of him, and it leapt onto the rafters. The board shook violently, nearly throwing 9 to the floor below. With a startled gasp, he grasped the plank desperately. The beast clung onto the wood with its sharp claws and raised a paw over the ragdoll. 9 tried to get to his feet and escape, but the machine was too swift. The claws tore through the air, and a jarring pain swept through 9's body as if it slammed onto him. He hurtled forward and hit a particularly sharp plank hard. He clawed at the plank, skid along it. 9 finally managed to grab the very end, his body dangling in midair. The young Stitchpunk froze, petrified, trying not to lose his grip. He looked over his shoulder, seeing how far below the ground was. To fall alone would cripple and probably kill him. Gathering his strength, Nine tried to pull himself back onto the board, and then the cat beast leapt onto it. He flinched, trying to keep his hold on the lath. The beast slowly extended a forelumb claw wide open and about to grab the Stitchpunk. Suddenly, as it leaned forward, the plank groaned and bent downwards. The cat beast yelled and sprang back, staring down below it, and realized the danger. Nine knew that he had to get back onto the rafters, or else the plan would fail. Suddenly, the monster got a horrible gleam in its eyes. He looked down at Nine, snarling softly. Then it left a clawed paw right over the plank. He saw it then, a large cracking across the board and the lath just in front of the beast. He gasped, realizing what the monster was going to do, and there was no way to stop it.
Hey, over here, you big ugly kitty cat!
Five's voice rang out. Nine gasped sharply, startled. He strained to see up the rafters and spotted the older rag doll on the buttress of the attic. A rock hit the cat beast in the side of the head and snapped around, snarling at Five. Turning, it left Nine alone and leapt towards the mechanic. Five's face fell as it lunged for him. He exclaimed in fright and turned to escape. However, the beast was far too swift. It slammed a claw upon him, roaring. Finally, it would have a soul to bring back to the master. And this time, it won't escape. Five covered his head and his arms as the beast roared triumphantly above him. Nine struggled onto the plank, getting to his feet and looking around desperately for something to save his friend. Whirling around, he spotted his blade, tethering in the rafters behind him. Reaching out, he grabbed it just before it fell. Bracing himself, he balanced the hilt of the blade onto his shoulders, just as Seven had taught him. With as much strength as he could summon, he threw it at the beast. The blade struck its rib cage, several sparks falling to the ground below.
It's me you want! Come over here! Leave him alone and come get me!
Nine yelled at it. The cat beast snarled, and much to its horror, scooped Five up within its jaws and bounded over to where Nine was standing. He braced himself. The raptor underneath the cat beast suddenly snapped beneath its front claws and plummeted forward. As its head was jerked backwards, Five was thrown into the air. The beast scrabbled desperately at the wood, trying to lift itself back up onto the rafters. Five cried out as he crashed through the ancient beams. He managed to grip the edge of one before he fell to his death. However, the plank he dangled from was very thin and bent with his weight. While the cat beast was distracted with trying to save itself, Nine rushed past it and ran to Five.
Nine, help!
The older ragdoll cried, slipping further and further away. The younger ragdoll immediately fell to his knees and reached out, trying to grab Five's hand.
Come on, reach! Grab my hand, Five, come on!
He yelled. Five reached for Nine's outstretched hand, straining when the wood gave away with his weight and snapped. Five cried out as he fell. Nine nearly threw himself over the edge as he lunged forward. Fingers wrapping around Five's hand, he caught him at the last possible second. Gripping him tightly and bracing himself, he pulled Five up as the mechanic hung perilously over the floor below him. The two finally managed to scramble up into the plank, panting suddenly. It shook as the beast appeared right up behind them, towering over the two as it cornered them. Nine shielded Five behind him, eyes wide with horror as the beast raised a claw ready to strike. Suddenly, a spear whistled through the air and sliced through the machine's shoulder. It shrieked as a figure leaped out from the shadows, tearing her spear from its shoulder. Sparks showered the loft, and flew everywhere, illuminating the form of Seven. She leaped onto its back, grabbing one of its spines and holding it tightly. The beast frailed, bucking violently and trying to throw her to the ground. However, Seven held on tightly, raising her spear right above the beast's central power system. going to destroy its mortal enemy so it could never be repaired again. The men stared on in admiration. 9 pushing 5 firmly into the direction of the buttress. The beast reared suddenly and threw itself down. One of its paws broke through the rafters, and it crashed through the planks. 7 was thrown forward with a cry, dangling over the cat beast's skull. It grasped the edge of the board and threw its head back. The warrior held on tightly, hooking her feet on its lower jaw as it regained its footing. Enraged, the beast reaching up and hooked its claw onto her right side. She cried out in pain as the claws tore right through her, and her grip slackened. The beast then ripped her off of its face with a snarl, and it threw her to great force that she flew through the air, colliding hard into a wall of the attic. She fell limply onto the buttress, motionless and silent.
No! 7!
9 cried as the cat beast pulled its paws through the wood, turning to look for 5, who disappeared in the commotion. 9's mind was whirling as he stood frozen, thoroughly overwhelmed. 7 was badly injured. She wasn't moving, and 5 had disappeared in the turmoil. He couldn't have fallen. He suddenly saw 5 waving frantically to him, hidden behind the large blocks of debris. 9 dashed forward and leapt behind the block where the beast's back was turned. He kneeled beside 5, who was trembling. He tried to keep his head, hoping and praying that 7 was okay. She had to be.
9, I'm so sorry. I tried to get away. I was trying to help. I'm sorry.
5 whispered, his hands shaking violently. 9 took his hands and tried to calm him. Listen, 5, I'm going to lure him to me, and I'll knock that book off. He pointed to the book, still propped under the rafter. And he'll be killed as it falls.
But 9, I can't let you just run out there alone.
5 began. His eyes growing wide. 9 hushed him hurriedly and became impatient. Damn it, 5, listen to me. We need to kill it, or the machine will find us. Trust me, he hissed, staring into the single eye of the older Stitch Punk. 5 nodded in understanding, his whole body trembling. 9 had rushed out of the open, madly waving his arms and yelling wordlessly to attract the beast's attention. The cat beast snarled as soon as it saw him, and chased him around the rafters. Each time it tried to knock 9 off the rafters, he would jump onto another lath. The claws always missed him by mere inches. He led it onto the plank he'd nearly fallen off of, heart pounding. He ran to the end, then turned around to face the cat beast. It hissed loudly, thinking it had him cornered and without an escape. 5 struggled not to rush to his friends, peeking out to his hiding place over so slightly. The cat beast reached for 9, but the plank nearly gave way underneath its weight. Growling, the monster continued to step forward, ready to slice through 9 and capture him, taking him to his death. However, 9 stayed just out of reach, and no matter how hard it strained, it could not touch him. It then took another step forward, right over the crack of the plank. 9 smiled and jumped to the plank next to the one the cat beast was now on. Alone, he rammed his shoulders into a heavy book, thrusting it off. The cat beast realized what was going on as the book fell and jerked on the rope. It snarled and tried to climb up to safety, but the plank smacked it in the face. The cat beast plummeted to the first floor with a deafening crash. Its hiss filled the air. The sharp end of the plank impaled it through its chest with a dull thud. Its central systems was immediately destroyed, sparks filling the air. The red eye lost its deadly glow as the monster died almost immediately. The hiss cut off sharply. The plank 9 was now standing on cracked underneath him as well, straining with his weight. He turned without a shout and leaped off the lath just in time before it split and fell into the floor below. Just barely managing to grab onto a splintering edge, 9 hung over the empty air. Five rushed forward out from behind the debris towards the young stitch punk. Reaching down, he grasped his shoulders tightly and heaved him back onto the rest of the lath. Panting heavily, both young men peered down to the floor far below, confirming the cat beast's certain death. As the dust rose, Nine paused for only half a second before looking up, seeing Seven still lying lifelessly on the buttress. He gasped and rushed toward her, Five close by.
9, 7.
He cried, falling to his knees beside her, his hands trembling as he gently placed a hand on her shoulder. He turned to lie on her back, holding her head tenderly to his other hand. Her eyes were closed tightly, and she was completely limp. In his arms, Nine shook his head, slightly overcome with terror. Five watched petrified, unable to move towards them.
Come on, Sev, wake up. It couldn't have killed you. You've been through worse than this. Wake up.
He pleaded with her, a note of hysteria in the young voice. He gave her a small shake, trembling with panic. She didn't respond. She wasn't even breathing. Shock overwhelmed Nine as he shook her again, trying to wake her. This couldn't have happened. It couldn't have possibly killed her. Seven was still limp and lifeless, even as he shook her once more. Nine could only sit, paralyzed with dismay and horror. He could feel his heart breaking as Seven remained still. His breathing began to overcome, shallow as he bent even closer to her.
No, Seven, wake up, please, wake up.
He begged her, slipping his arms underneath her and holding her close, cradling her still body. She remained silent, and his heart fell. The cat beast could have managed a final victory. It could have finally slain its enemy. There was nothing more he could do. He had been too slow, too late. He hadn't saved her, and now she was gone. It had taken her from him. Nine bent his head, resting his head on her chest and holding her to his heart. He closed his eyes tightly and let go a strangled sob of agony.
No, please, this couldn't be real.
He couldn't have just lost her. Suddenly, Seven's chest rose, and she began a cough hard. Nine's eyes snapped open, and he jolted back. Her chest rose and fell with each strenuous breath of life she took, gasping desperately as her brow knitted. Nine allowed a deep sigh to escape him as he went limp with relief. Seven was still alive. Thought you guys might need some help, she said lightly past the coughs. Nine gave a feeble laugh, feeling weak with elevation. Seven hadn't been lost after all. He then slid his arms around her and hugged her tightly, hiding his face in her shoulder. Nine then realized that he was doing immediately withdrew in embracement. Seven, however, reached up and wrapped her left arm around his shoulder, burying her face into his neck, her fingers digging into his back. Her right arm was lying limpously across her chest. Nine's face grew warm, but he relaxed, throwing all humiliation to the winds as he hugged Seven back. Five heaved a sigh of relief, getting to his feet and walking towards them. Seven, Nine began, but he trailed off, horror overcoming him. The sound of creaking and groaning wood reached him, and he looked down to where they were sitting. The wooden floor was beginning to crack right underneath them. The cat beast had torn the fragile, weak cabin apart, and it couldn't hold up any longer.
We gotta get out of here. Come on, guys.
Five cried. Nine helped Seven up to his feet, keeping an arm around her. The three ran to the edge of the buttress, splintered to the bookcase. The cabin began to groan and sway. The bookcase tethered, about to fall over. It was the only way the three stitch punks could get down from the rafters. If they jumped, they'd be killed. 5 leaped onto the top of the bookcase, then reached up for 7. 9 helped her step down from the rafters into 5's arms, then following her onto the top of the bookcase, suddenly began to sway, slipping from where it was wedged against the rafters and began to topple to the floor. 9 saw what happened and grabbed 7 around the waist. He gathered her to his arms, then threw her onto the buttress behind the bookcase. It remained solid and hadn't broken yet. 9 wanted to make sure she'd be safe. He didn't know if he was going to survive the fall or not. He then took 5's hand and tried to shove him into the buttress, but it was too late. The bookcase groaned and leaked forward. 9 and 5 desperately scrambled along the top, trying to avoid being crushed. The 2 stitch punks managed to just get to the back of the bookcase, and it came smashing down to the floor. 9 and 5 were thrown from the bookcase into the floor. 9 groaned lightly, shaking his head.
5, are you okay?
9 cried over the groaning of the cabin. 5's head appeared through a cloud of dust, nodding. 9 then looked up to the buttress, seeing that 7 had been left up there, safe, but stranded. Her fingers were curled tight around her right arm, and she took rather shock as she realized she was trapped. 9 climbed onto the back of the fallen bookcase, then looked back to the warrior.
7, jump! I'll catch you!
He yelled, opening his arms. She paused hesitantly, her stubbornness and a bit of anxiety showing in her face. She wasn't supposed to be the one needing rescuing. However, it seemed she had no choice. Seeing her hesitancy, 9 reached up even further to her.
I promise I will catch you! Sev, please trust me! 7, you need to jump!
9 cried, seeing that the rest of the cabin was beginning to crack. 5 stood nearby, terrified. 7's expression then turned into one of determination. She lowered onto the crouch. Pain shot through her facial features, but she clenched her jaw and leapt. She fell through nothing but open air. 7 half expected to land on a hard wooden floor, but her other half persistently told her that 9 was going to catch her. After falling what seemed like forever, 7 landed right into 9's arms. The 2 tumbled backwards off the bookcase. 9 landed on his back, however. He kept 7 tightly in his arms, and she was unhurt. He sat up and stood, keeping her in his arms. Then he and 5 began to run to the stairs, trying to get out of the cabin before it calmed down. The large piece of lumber suddenly fell from the roof and swung down. It smacked 9 right on the side of the head and sent him spiraling. 7 was knocked out from his arms and landed painfully on the right side. 5 whirled around, trying to go back to them. The walls were crashing down around them. 9 shook his head and reached for 7, trying to get her before she was crushed. Then another large piece of timber fell from the ceiling and crashed through the second floor right beside 9. The floor gave way underneath him. He, 7, and 5 plummeted to the ground below them. The dust began to settle. The only splinters of the roof and second floor fell now. However, the entire cabin was slowly beginning to collapse. It was only held by a single beam now. 5 slowly opened his eyes and looked up. He was completely trapped underneath the rubble, but unscathed, a large board blocking his escape.
Oh, no, 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 no,
he said softly, touching the top of the board with his hands. With a grunt, he pushed up as hard as he could muster. The block of wood that trapped him was lifted and landed on the side of the dull thud. 5 quickly climbed out of the hole and was stranded on a mountain of splintering wood.
Guys!
He called. His frantic voice echoed throughout the destroyed house.
Guys!
Somewhere in the rubble, 9 woke up, pushing himself up. He was trapped in a small hollow with barely any room to sit up.
5!
He called back, trying to look through the debris, where only a hint of life streamed in. 5 then appeared, his single eye peering back at 9 through the gap.
Are you okay?
He asked the younger stitch punk below him.
Yeah, I think so.
9 replied, trying to push the rubble off of him. 5 pulled as well, and soon there were enough space for the young male to climb out. He grasped 9's hand and pulled him out. They looked up as a slight cracking noise reached them. The rest of the cabin was collapsing now, and the beam nearly gave way.
Go! Hurry!
9 said, pushing 5 towards the crumbled door in the front of them.
What about 7?
The two hadn't heard one sound from the female ragdoll.
I'll get her, just go!
9 yelled over the cracking sound of the wood. He gave 5 a persistent push on the arm before running into the dust and rubble. 5 wanted to follow, but instead turned around and ran for the opening.
7! 7!
9 kept calling, trailing lightly, looking around desperately, trying to find her.
9!
7 called, reaching him, and he nearly smiled. She was all right.
7, where are you?
9 called back to her, relieved to hear her voice. I'm over here, she answered, her words cut off by a small, feeble cry of pain.
I'm coming. Just hang on,
9 promised her as he followed her voice across the floor and began to dig as fast as he could without making a rubble collapse on top of 7. Finally, he uncovered her. She was laying on her side, breathing labored. He could see why she wasn't able to free herself. She was trapped underneath a heavy piece of lumber.
7, are you all right?
9 asked as he crawled down to her. He seized the wood and lifted up, concentrating his strength into freeing 7. She climbed out from underneath the piece of lumber and looked gratefully up at him. Fine, I'm fine, she said, placing a hand on the debris around her and lifting herself to her feet.
Come on, we gotta go,
he said to her urgently. She nodded, and something startled 9 at the way she held herself. Yeah, I'm coming. She clutched her spear, but as they tried to climb out of the debris, 7 collapsed and fell to the ground.
7!
9 cried, immediately jumping down after her. I'm fine, she repeated stubbornly, trying to stand up once more, but she fell. Her knees buckled underneath her. 9 caught her as she fell sideways and held her upright with his arm. She was slashing across her right arm, hip and thigh. Deep, horrible gashes. The claws of the cat beast had torn her right down to her metal skeletal structure.
You're hurt,
9 said softly, horror evident in his face. He knew that she had been hurt, but not this badly. She looked indignantly at him. I'm fine, she growled, pushing him away and getting herself to her feet. 9 looked at her in concern, knowing she wasn't fine. 7 sighed impatiently. We have got to get out of here before the whole thing comes down on top of us, she said firmly. They both tried climbing out of the hole once more. 7 finally making it. 9 grasped her arm and pulled her up. They were finally standing on top of the rubble, and they glanced at the rooftop. It was still creaking and groaning. The beam holding the rest of the cabin up was beginning to bow, splintering as it gave way. 9 gave a small gasp as they sprinted to the exit where 5 was standing.
Come on, guys!
He yelled apprehensively, waving to them.
Run!
But they needed no encouragement. The groaning became louder as they ran across the shattered floor. 7's footsteps became more and more labored as she clutched her arm in pain and growing intensely. Suddenly, she tripped and was sent spiraling, unable to get back up. She tried, but soon gave up and lay on the ground panting.
7!
9 cried as he wheeled around the bed to her. No, leave me here, you idiot! She yelled at him angrily, pushing, forcing his chest and making him nearly stumble.
I'm not going to leave you,
he said firmly as he slid his arms underneath her and brought her to his chest, cradling her safely in his arms. She groaned softly. The searing pain exploded within her like a storm. More blocks of timber and debris began to fall around him. 9 ran across the floor, keeping 7 close to his chest, the rubble almost falling on top of them. A large piece of roof nearly crushed them both, but he managed to leap out of the way, tucking Seven's head into his chest to protect her. The beam holding up the cabin finally snapped, splinters falling everywhere. 9 ducked as they flew past him, and the rest of the cabin finally going down. It groaned loudly, toppling in on itself. 9 threw himself through the small gap of the door, clearing the destruction. He and 5 flung themselves onto the ground and covered their heads. 5 threw an arm over 9's shoulder, as the young Stitchpunk protectively positioned himself over 7. The old cabin finally collapsed. Rocks and wood were strewn everywhere as a cloud of dust engulfed the Stitchpunks. Lifting their heads, the 3 looked over their shoulders to see the dust rising from the rebels slowly. The cabin nothing more than splinters and rocks now. 5 stood panting, but 9 sat to his knees by 7, who laid on her back.
"You shouldn't have done that, 9. You were nearly killed," she said scornfully, propping herself up on her elbows to where she could peer incredulously into 9's face.
So were you. I could never let that happen,"
he said firmly. 7 blinked surprised, but then smiled gently at him. 9 returned it. But then she gave a quiet gasp as she grimaced, the pain intensifying. She bent her head, her chin resting on her chest.
"Damn, this is gonna ruin my whole day,"
she scoffed weakly, wincing and biting her lower lip. Her fingers curled into fists, and another surge of pain rocketed through her shoulder badly. 9's hands hovered over her, unsure of what he could do. Instead, he turned and gestured to the other male Stitchpunk.
5, she's hurt,"
9 said to 5, who immediately came over. The mechanic looked over 7's wounds, biting his lower lip. He turned to 9.
"Well, we had to move somewhere that's not out in the open. Then I can heal her."
9 nodded and leaned toward 7. As gently as he could, he slipped his arms underneath the crook of 7's knee and behind her back. He stood, 7 clutched tightly in his arms. She made a small sound of discomfort. Another jarring burst of pain shot through her. Usually 7 would have refused any help from another man. She would have insisted that she was fine enough to walk to the shelter on her own. However, much of her own confusion, 7 merely closed her eyes and rested her head against 9's zipped chest. He followed 5 to a small overhang nearby, taking care not to jostle the injured female Stitchpunk too much. 9 and 5 kneeled underneath the overhang, tucking themselves as far back as they could. 5 quickly slid off his pack, rummaging around inside of it after tossing the wood splinters around the air in of annoyance. 9 tenderly removed 7's skullmet, placing it on the ground. He then placed his hand behind her head, holding it up as she laid back. She smiled weakly up at him, finding herself very grateful for his help.
5, is she going to be okay?"
9 asked him. 5 turned around towards them and leaned down, looking at 7's cut closely.
"They're deep, but easily fixable. Like with the winged beast, remember?"
5 said with a relief, going back and searching through his pack.
"Vividly."
9 answered swiftly, not wanting to remember. 7 snorted from below, and 9 looked at her.
"Why are you asking if I'm going to be okay? They're my injuries. Shouldn't you be asking me?"
she said, obviously annoyed. 9 blinked at her, then bent his head embarrassed, breaking eye contact from the female Stitchpunk. 7 rolled her eyes and gently looked at 9's fingers. She took him. He looked up at her.
"It'll be okay,"
she said, and he smiled. 5 then gave a slight
"Ah!"
and brought forth a long silver needle and a far amount of dark gray thread.
Okay, here. I need you to lift her up,
5 said, instructing 9. He pressured his hand to her on her back gently, carefully not to touch her scar, and lifted her into a semi-sitting position. 5 tightened the thread in the eye of the needle, then leaned forward and slipped it through her canvas skin.
Thank you,
7 said, as 9 and 5 brought the needle through her thigh. He turned his gaze from 5 to the female. She was smiling at him warmly, and he tentatively smiled back, unable to help it. She then gave a small gasp as the mechanic continued to heal her. Sharp pain shot through her body.
Can you tell me what I did wrong in the fighting the beast?
7 asked breathlessly in a feeble attempt at joking manner. 9's brow frowned, and he shook his head.
Nothing.
The beast was, 9 began, but 7 abruptly cut him off.
9, there's always something you've done wrong if you got injured. Everything is key in battle.
7 insisted stubbornly. Her black eyes hardened. 9 was nearly as stubborn as she was, and he shook his head again. 7, you're an invisible warrior. These machines are many times our size, and it takes an insane amount of bravery to kill one. You did nothing wrong, Sev. Don't ever think that, 9 said, giving her hand a small squeeze. She winced as the needle passed through her skin again, then scoffed in annoyance.
And how many times do I owe you my life now?
She asked, looking up at 9 in irritation. I'm not keeping track. How many times you need me, I'll be there, he said. 7 blinked, then smiled softly and squeezed their hands together. With her hip and thigh now healed, 5 then moved on to the rip on her arm. He frowned slightly, seeing that this was where the cat beast's claw had been most deeply pierced 7. As gently as he could, he inserted the needle through 7's canvas skin. She winced, her fingers nearly cracked 9's hand as she gripped even tighter, fiercely bursting in pain, exploding in her arm.
I'm okay, guys. I'm fine,
she told them reassuringly, as they both looked down at her in concern. 5 and 9 shared a quick look of doubt in 7's words before 5 went back to healing her. She kept a strongly impassive look in her face, but 9 knew that she was in a great deal of pain. It was obvious in how tight she gripped his hand. He held her back, squeezing tightly when 5 brought the needle out of her arm.
All right. You should be okay now, 7.
5 said, cutting the thread and putting the needle back to the pack. 7's injuries were now healed. 9 held the warrior back to her feet as she gazed up at him. They smiled at one another before 7 bent down and packed up her skullmet. She slipped it back to her head, then straightened. 7 stood tall, flexing her arm, and smiled gratefully at 5. He smiled back before walking to a pile of debris that was once the cabin to find 7's spear and 9's staff. 9 stared at 7, unable to look away. She seemed to shimmer. She was so beautiful. He was caught in that spell again. Something that made his whole body feel weak. Warmth crept through the inner workings, although his body was most prominently on his face.
Come on. We gotta find the others,
5 said, shaking 9's arm gently. He jumped, startled out of his daze, and nodded, 5 handing him his pen blade, which he gripped tightly to his fist.
Thanks,
9 said softly, and the trio started walking across the wasteland to find the others. End of chapter 13.